Welcome to Awake.
How have you been?
I've been busy and like a lot of people this year, doing a lot of personal healing in between other stuff as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like these times are calling for that.
Definitely, it's really a time to sort of reach back into your history and anything that hasn't been resolved, is coming up right now to be healed. That's been my experience and the experience of pretty much everyone around me as well.
Yeah. In that process, it seems like in my experience, some of that seems to require I don't know, do you find that the healing instead of having to do it, sometimes it's just some of these old patterns coming up and being brought to awareness, and then you sort of have to or not have to, but you sort of end up being able to act separately from the old pattern in a way to kind of rewire your brain or whatever's happening.
Yeah, definitely. I guess it depends where you are on your healing journey in terms of how you need to deal with it. But certainly in
Mhm.
the later stages, if you're just about on top of it, then that may well be your experience for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, because I've found myself like, you know, kind of uh, feeling internally, having the feelings of intense fear and at times having some, intense fear or anxiety or moments of panic and even certain like thought patterns. But I've still got a part of me that can stay sort of centered where I can act separately from what the feelings are. And I've sort
Yeah.
of interpreted that as in doing that, I'm sort of showing my brain or my limbic system or whatever historical parts of me that that some other part of me is kind of guiding the ship, and those parts
Yeah.
can sort of reconfigure themselves in the background
Yeah.
or
Yeah, that sounds to me like you're in the integration phase, like you've really, you've done the hard work and now it's a matter of integrating those different behaviors and sort of finalizing any healing that needs to happen. I just realized I'm not recording yet, so
Mm.
let me hit the record button and then we can start over. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, that's perfect. It's just a little something to warm up on there anyways.
Okay, I'm recording at this end. It's great.
Awesome. So I'm curious what you've been busy with lately. Um, I know you've mentioned a couple times when I've contacted you that you've been pretty busy. I know there's just a lot going on in the world right now. So yeah, I'm curious what kind of stuff you've been up to.
Yeah, there sure is. I've taken a couple of breaks from podcasting this year just because I've had other stuff going on, and some of it's been for my own personal healing work as well. So I'm trying to get back into a regular podcasting routine, and I'm also just noting what's going on in the world. And if I really feel like there's a strong message that seems to go out, I'm getting an episode out whenever I can. So there's been that. I've been doing a lot of back end work, just done a little bit more of an upgrade on the Future Sense website and a lot of management stuff around the foundation that I run. So I think I've mentioned before in podcasts, I've got a charitable foundation that I run as the executive director. So, part of my time is spent managing that. And particularly at the moment with COVID and the whole economic disruption thing, it's required a little bit more attention than usual.
Hmm.
Uh, I'm working on a documentary film with Mitch Schultz. And Mitch, of course, was the director of DMT, the Spirit Molecule, and has been involved in a few other great documentaries as well. Mitch and I are in the early stages of developing a documentary series about the Graves's model and about human history and where we are at the moment in the change process and where we're headed in the near future, particularly with the leap into second tier consciousness. So we've got a small team that we're working with. Mitch and Nevi, our editor, are based in Austin, Texas, and we're working with Martin Stebbing, who's a graphics guy based in Copenhagen. So we're on Zoom a lot talking about the work. And like I said, it's very early stage. We're working on a sort of a trailer slash teaser at the moment, which is just going to give us a bit of a visual framework to then start working on a feature length piece, which is going to be the first release. So that is planned to be like roughly an hour long, looking at a condensed version of human evolution from a Graves research-based perspective, and poking into the future, looking at this unfolding that's going on right at the moment, and then the big shift into second tier, which I'm expecting to happen on a sort of a global scale within the next 15 to 20 years. So there's a lot of work to be done there. It's probably going to be, another year or two before we release anything much. But that's part of what I'm working on. And also, my partner and I are working on a plant medicine project. So I rediscovered my Indigenous family roots within the last couple of years. And they'd been lost since my grandmother was separated from her mother soon after birth back in 1909. So all of that time, we'd lost contact with our Indigenous arm of the family, and we've just reconnected recently. I'm just about to make my third adventure up to visit them again up in central Queensland. And we've been guided to do some plant medicine work with local plants on our country up there. Gurung country it's called. So my partner Julia, she's quite a plant medicine expert. She lectured for 8 years for the Australian Bushflower Essences organisation run by Ian White, and she's quite accustomed with the processes of making plant medicines from native flowers. And we're going to get up there and hopefully in the next couple of weeks we're going to make our first medicine from Gurung country up there. So we're looking forward to that. That's kind of the headlines of what I'm working on, and it's keeping me pretty busy at the moment.
That sounds cool. Are those plant medicines psychedelic then, or something different?
Not these ones. The native ones that we're working on are not psychoactive in a general sense. Some of them have some mild psychoactivity, but certainly not psychedelic. No, so it's a more conventional type of medicine.
That sounds awesome.
Well, when I say conventional, it's not really conventional at all, because it's a very spiritually derived essence, kind of homeopathic in a way, but it's certainly not in a psychedelic category, no.
So are those indigenous plant medicine concoctions, or is it more of her own spin on things?
It's based on the work of an Australian guy called Ian White, who came from quite a lineage of plant medicine makers, and it's working with Australian native flowers.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really, as far as I know, it's not come from a very clear indigenous lineage, but it's working with flowers that were used as medicines for sure by our indigenous Aboriginals here in Australia. What happened with this particular one that we're going to start working on is I had a dream early in the year. It was soon after I came back from overseas and soon after the whole COVID thing was really going down globally. And in the dream, I was up on my traditional country up there, Gurung country, and my ancestors came to me and took me to a place and showed me these daisies. And they told me that these are medicines. And so I woke up out of the dream and I thought, holy hell, that was very interesting. And I jumped on the web to look at, daisy medicine and what it's used for. And one of the things it can be used for is an antiviral, which seems very appropriate at the moment. And so on my second trip up to connect with the family up there earlier this year, my partner Julia and I went walking in a place called Kanya Gorge, which is in the western part of the country there. And I found the daisies that I had the dream about. And we went back and looked them up, and sure enough, it's called an Australian native daisy. And so this time we're going back up to make some medicine from it. And I've been working with some of my relatives up there who are quite interested in developing further natural medicines from the country up there. So it may well be, well, without a doubt, acknowledged as an Indigenous medicine once we've made it, and my Indigenous relatives working with it. Yeah.
Perfect. So there's so many different things that I've thought about wanting to talk to you about over the past since well the last time I talked to you. So I'm trying to like figure out what the best places to start. But I'm thinking that I want to mention specifically. I know you mentioned the name Future Sense, but I want to let people know right away so they don't have to wait to get to the end of the podcast that you
Sure.
have an awesome show called Future Sense, and they should definitely check it out. The format has seemed to change quite a bit. It used to be a weekly show with co-host Nick Jeans. Now it's sort of just you. It seems to be a bit more, I would say, intentional, maybe. Could be
Yeah.
the
So,
right word.
as you say, it's futuresense.it on the web if people want to go check it out. And it started back in late 2017 as a local radio show here on Bay FM in Byron Bay. And my colleague Nick Jeans has been a radio announcer there for years. And so it was really him and I just having a chat about possibilities that gave birth to the show. And then it became a weekly radio show for a couple of years. And as a weekly radio show, we had to fill 2 hours, so there was a lot of chit chat and interruptions and songs and all those sorts of things like you get on the radio. And for that reason, I guess it wasn't as intentional as it has become now. And then because of the COVID shutdown, the radio studios closed for a while and we couldn't record. So then we started recording from my place in a similar kind of format, although it wasn't a radio show, so it became a little bit more focused. And then I kind of got guided to go solo with it over the last few months and make it fairly short and concise. So recently I've just been putting out sort of 15 or 20-minute or 30-minute episodes as opposed to 2 hours. I'm probably not going to get back to weekly episodes anytime soon, but I'll certainly be putting episodes out as often as I can manage in between all the other things that I'm doing.
Yeah, well, it feels to me like it's a little more bang for your buck, I would say. I mean, I really enjoyed the loose format and the conversational style. I mean, it's just fun to listen to you guys talk for me personally, but I think it seems a little bit more purposeful now and more, yeah, I guess very relevant to what's happening right now and sort of like just helping people understand what's going on versus just sort of like, you know, being a little more conversational.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, thanks. That's good feedback, and that's certainly my intention is just to make it as useful as possible, and as you say, more bang for your buck kind of thing. Yeah.
so I know you've, in many of your own episodes in your show, and when you've been on my show, you've gone over the Graves model a million times. So I don't want to take up too much time with that, but maybe you could just give like the quick elevator pitch just for anybody who maybe tunes into this for the first time, just to give a little context for maybe where we
Sure,
at.
sure. Incidentally, I just put up a resources page on futuresense.it, and there's a quick guide to the layers on there, and I'm going to keep adding stuff as I get time to that resources page. But the Graves model came from a body of research that began in the early 1950s and went on for about 10 years or thereabouts. And Clare Graves was a professor of psychology in upstate New York. He involved a bit over 1,000 people, 1,065 to be exact, in his field study, and he did all sorts of research in terms of understanding their worldview and their values and their behaviors. Many different kinds of data collection methods, including observation, self-reporting, constructed social scenarios where he would observe people's behavior, those sorts of things. And then all of the data that he gathered, he gave to a group of 7 peers, and he said to them, without wanting to try and shape their interpretation of the data, he just said, have a look at all of this and see what patterns you can find in it. And what came out of that was absolute gold, in my opinion, a very, very insightful model, which still stands out in today's world as a unique insight into human nature. And there were 3 main elements to it. One was he realized this connection between the complexity of our life conditions and the development or evolution of human consciousness. So human consciousness is quite plastic and adaptive, and depending upon the challenges that we're faced with in everyday life, our consciousness will adapt to operate at certain levels of complexity. And he mapped those levels of complexity out as 8 levels, he called them at the time. I'm calling them layers these days, because he did explain that they're not freestanding versions of consciousness. They're all nested inside each other. So you've got the most simple, basic survival consciousness at the core, and then over the top of that is another layer and another layer and another layer. And he mapped 8 of those. And those 8 layers, when you look back at the evolution of our species, they conform to hunter-gatherer behavior, traditional tribal behavior, martial or warlike behavior, agricultural era behavior, scientific industrial era behavior. And then interestingly, they go 3 steps into what is essentially the future when you're talking about the global sort of dominant consciousness at the moment. The next one after the scientific industrial being what he called relativistic, which it's often called postmodern, but it's a very human-centric, anthropocentric, you might say, consciousness that's interpreting everything on the basis of human experience. Like, how does it feel to, experience this, and how are we connected to nature? It's very network-centric, and it's what is unfolding right now around the world as the scientific industrial structures crumble. The next thing that we're seeing rushing into the space is this relativistic mindset, very humanistic mindset, saying, we've lost our humanity. We've got to return to considering the human experience and looking after people rather than just thinking about money. And we have to network together. We have to collaborate, cooperate. And these layers, Graves identified, they swing between a focus on individuality and a focus on community. So we've been through a very individual era with the scientific industrial layer 5, and now we're moving back to the communal focus in layer 6. And then beyond layer 6, Graves found that there was this, what he called a momentous leap between 6 and 7, where the coping capacity of a human just went through the roof. It was literally a kind of quantum leap in our capacity to solve problems and make sense of reality. And so he identified a very small number of people back in the 50s and 60s who had made that leap. And so he gathered a reasonable amount of data on it. And how many people there are out in the world right now who are operating at that 7th level, which is the first step into the second tier, what he called the second tier of consciousness. I'm not sure, but it's an integrative way of understanding reality where for the first time it seems the left and right hemispheres of our brain are working in unison. And the first 6 stages alternating between individuality and community, that is also a reflection of a left brain and right brain focus. And so we've stopped kind of flipping between those 2 things, and all of a sudden we can bring them all together and work together with those 2 things, with the left brain and right brain concepts. And that's part of why we've got this amazing extended capacity in layer 7 and beyond. And then layer 8, he only found 6 people who exhibited some evidence of that, didn't gather enough data to really say much more than, well, it looks like it's got a kind of community focus, although it's still integrated, and it seems very spiritual. He said it's very much based around intuition, and what we've kind of put together, since Graves passed away, is it seems like this layer 8 is going to be the layer that brings the next real global stability for us. And we don't have a time frame on that, but if I had to guess, I'd say sort of 20 plus years from now, probably. Thereabouts anyway. So that was the second key thing that came out of his work, was this layered consciousness pattern. The first being the adaptive relationship with complexity of our life conditions. And then the third thing that came out of his work was an understanding of how the change process in between those layers plays out, what the trajectory looks like. And it's very, very similar to Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. It's kind of like a process of feeling like something needs to change, everything falling apart, going through a chaotic alchemist's furnace type experience where, we really feel the pressure, and that pressure causes us to rewire our brains and change our body chemistry and those sorts of things. A big breakthrough on the back end of that, and then an integration phase where we sort of greet the world with renewed energy, and we're all enthusiastic again, and we're seeing the world differently, and we want to become stable, and we come back to a place of new stability that's more capable, which represents a more complex layer of those layers of consciousness. So that's kind of like a nutshell explanation.
That's great. So it seems like, I mean, it's been for people who are maybe further along in that development, it's been pretty obvious that there are some, you know, have been breakdowns of this layer 5 structures for quite some time now, but it seems like right now there's very acute signs of this happening with the election stuff in the US and COVID and all the polarization and all of this stuff going on. Like how do you feel about where we're at in that process of the transition from, the layer 5 dominance into this layer 6?
What I think is that layer 6 is in some ways not going to be dominant, in the way that layer 5 was. I mean, layer 5 was very individually oriented, and layer 6 is very communally oriented. So we shouldn't expect it to show up in the same way. In some respects, it's already got a pretty strong hold on the world, though, because it's network centric, and you look at the impact that networks are having on the world right now. So layer 6's technology has certainly changed the world so much that layer 5 thinking really can't keep up with that. It can't manage it. And if we look at all the things that are failing right now, they're pretty much all the things that were designed before the internet came into existence. And the internet has made the world so much more connected and so much more complex that these old systems just can't cope with it, and I'm constantly laughing at the Australian government systems here in Australia when they try and introduce computer systems into these old government departments that were designed before the internet existed. And it's just ridiculous, the basic mistakes that they're making. And it's a reason why our current forms of government just aren't going to survive this transition. And I guess the US election is front and center, a global stage show of those failures right now, right before our eyes. And in terms of time, what it looks to me is going to happen is that we're really going to just go through almost like a rolling change process right through the layer 6 influence. And layer 6 is creating certainly a foundation for us to leap off and make this tremendous momentous leap that Graves mentioned into second tier at layer 7. But I think it's going to be hard to pick, where layer 6 peaks and finishes and where layer 7 really kicks in. I don't think it's going to be, certainly not as clear cut as things like the scientific industrial revolutions, which were very clear markers that showed, okay, these are real, turning points for that shift between the agricultural layer 4 era and layer 5. I think it's going to be harder to sort of spot that. When you look at the length of time that each one of these layers of consciousness has been dominant on the planet, they get shorter and shorter and shorter on a kind of a sort of logarithmic or reverse logarithmic scale, I guess. And we can see, looking backwards, that the dominance of the scientific industrial era was, maybe 300 years roughly. The agricultural era was dominant for many thousands of years. And so we should expect no more than a decade or two really for layer 6. And then we're going to be into second tier. And I can see that there's a tipping point coming around 2032. There are many, many different sources and techniques that are indicating 2032 as a tipping point. And I suspect that will be the tipping point for second tier influence on the planet, with a form of stability coming in the late 2030s probably. So right now, I think between now and 2032, I think it's going to be a very confusing and chaotic time. Because of the nature of layer 6, we shouldn't expect things to get too organized. Layer 6 is very focused on the process of communication, but it tends to often lose sight of concrete outcomes and gets lost in just wanting to keep communicating and talking about things. And it's, I guess it's kind of like going into a network where it's a flat network and there's no clear delineation of what's important except for the human bond, and so one of that was the key driver of layer 6 is deep human connection. And so layer 6 is not going to be distracted or attracted by hard evidence in an old scientific method. It's going to be attracted and distracted by human relationships. And where things feel the best, where the bonds are the deepest, that's where the six attention is going to go. So, that's going to be very healing for the planet when you look at the damage that's been done over the last hundreds and thousands of years in terms of conflict between peoples. Layer 6 is bringing tremendous peace and healing to that process. And it's solving a whole bunch of other problems by shifting resources around, but it's not going to bring stable global structures. They're going to come after the second tier influence really kicks in.
It seems like, so how does that factor in the extreme polarization? I mean, some of it maybe comes from the fact that there are plenty of people still in, 5 dominant and some in 6, and they're seeing the world completely different. But also it seems like even amongst people who might all be sort of more in a 6 dominant space are still sort of getting sucked into these more tribalized, where they're not able to entertain somebody else's perspective. Or I think I've maybe heard even you on Future Sense mention before that maybe one of the sort of shadow aspects of layer 6 is sort of accepting everybody except for some specific group or the people who aren't accepting or whatever that might be. Maybe you could expand on that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. I often make a joke about it and say, we're all really loving people here. We treat people right, not like that guy's over there, those guys over there. So there's this kind of contradiction, in the behavior sometimes, where if you get a group of people together who are all layer 6, it's going to be beautiful, peaceful and loving and all that kind of thing. But as soon as they bump into another layer of consciousness, it's like, here they come. So Graves found in his research that in layers 1 through 6, which he called the first tier of human consciousness, there's an inbuilt rejection factor in each value system associated with a layer. So what that means is that people will prefer to be around other people who share the same layer, the same value system as them, and they will automatically reject different values that come from other layers. So even though layer 6 is essentially seeking inner peace, it's seeking social peace, and it's seeking to rebalance our connection with nature, which are all good things that the earth needs, they are still rejecting older value systems. So, and the strongest rejection is usually the value system that we've just come from. So, at a personal level, when we grow through layer 5 and into layer 6, then layer 5 seems like old, out of date, bad, and even to the point of we want to destroy it. And we're seeing a lot of that talk on the planet at the moment. People who want to just destroy industrialization completely and go back to living like layer 2 or something like that. And that's a predictable aspect of layer 6. So that rejection factor is really the biggest issue that we're seeing. And it's the source of all the conflict throughout history, is this rejection of other values and not being able to understand people from different value systems or layers. The other thing that's coming into play is what's called a values regression. So when we go through the change process, early on in the change process, we realize that, okay, the way I'm living, the values that I'm living through aren't working very well. Therefore, something needs to change. I'm not sure what it is, though. And so, of course, we can't see into the future and our future values. What we do is we look to the past and we go, okay, maybe if I go back to the way I used to live 10 years ago, maybe that'll work again because it worked back then, right? So we go on this journey backwards through the value systems. And what that means at the moment is people who are sort of transitioning into layer 6 are going backwards to layer 4 sometimes, or layer 4, because they're coming out of 5, right? 5 isn't working for them. And so they'll go back to 4, which is really rigid, authoritarian kind of behavior, and we're seeing a lot of that at the moment. That's really being highlighted, that layer 4 authoritarian, black and white. There's only one way to do things, and it's got to be my way or the highway. And for some people, they may even be slipping further back into layer 3, which is very warlike, and sees everything as a power struggle and wants to fight in order to resolve problems. So it's a mixture of those things. Firstly, just the inbuilt rejection factor, which means that everybody who's popping into layer 6 at the moment doesn't like layer 5 or layer 4 or layer 3 or layer 2 or layer 1. There are resonances, there are resonances between the communal systems. So layer 6 may resonate with layer 4 in some ways because of the conformist nature of the communal systems. And layer 6 usually resonates very strongly with layer 2, which is our traditional sort of indigenous tribal kind of ways of living. So you get a harmonic there between the communal systems. Which also plays out, and the sum result is what we're seeing in the world right now. A lot of authoritarian kind of stuff getting thrown around. A lot of people saying that's wrong. We've got to destroy the scientific industrial way of living and change the whole world to live this way. Which is the layer 6 way.
Yep.
And thankfully, once we shift into second tier consciousness, that rejection factor disappears. So one of the things that makes layer 7 so capable is that it can directly sense the frequency of value systems. And so when interacting with another person, a second tier individual can read their frequency and go, okay, this person's coming from here, and there's an inherent instinctive understanding of what that means and how I need to communicate with that person, and that just changes everything, because all of a sudden we don't want to fight people, we don't want to destroy different cultures, we don't want to destroy different value systems, lots more becomes possible.
Well, it makes sense because I see so much of you could call it communication, but it's not really communication per se. It's maybe an attempt, but it's mostly arguing or fighting or accusing people of being. Everybody's accusing each other of being Nazis, basically. But something I've been kind of thinking about is, and tell me how you see this. But so I've made it a point to, just out of my own interest, like follow people on social media that have completely opposing viewpoints, and just really sort of kind of try to find the best argument for each side of an argument, the best evidence for each side of an argument, or the most prominent person on each side of some political debate or whatever it might be. And it's just very interesting to see, sort of bits of truth in each side that each side would probably agree on. But I don't know, I almost get the feeling that because of our isolation, the extreme amount of isolation that has come from the layer 5, people are so desperate to feel like they're accepted into a certain tribe or a certain group, that it almost seems to shut down the ability to sort of think on both sides of the aisle, and that they have to sort of subscribe to a certain, to certain ideas or thoughts or whatever along the lines of what fits into that group, so that they make sure that they're accepted and held in that group, just for like a survival aspect of that feeling of belonging. Does that seem accurate?
It does. It's very accurate. What you said at the end there about that need to conform, to fit in, to be accepted is a key driver of layer 6. So, we're looking for deeper human connection, and to get that deeper human connection, we've got to be accepted into a peer group. And so this caused a lot of confusion over the years amongst people who've studied some of Graves's work and who've studied developmental psychology generally, and even Ken Wilber, who I have a tremendous amount of respect for, who's done some amazing work. Even Ken got confused with this. And the confusion comes from the fact that most people don't understand that the morality and the value system of layer 6 is built around this need for deep connection. And so if you just look at the surface level stuff, like what people are talking about, and who they're hanging out with or what topics they might be interested in, you don't really tap into that deeper driver. And because people are just chasing the connection, they can change what they're talking about. They can change what they're interested in. They can change who they're hanging out with. And it looks like they're being dishonest. It looks like they're being immoral sometimes, It looks like they're not being honest to their morals, but actually they are, because they're being genuine in terms of that deep need for connection, and that's what they're following. So it can create it has created a great amount of confusion around the nature of this particular layer of consciousness, in the technical world of people who study these things. And you've just got to understand that. You've got to understand that what people are looking for is connection. And in terms of, finding ways of convincing people or changing their opinions and those sorts of things, it's a common misconception that you can logic someone out of their value system, but you really can't.
Mm-hmm.
The value system is rooted in subconscious frameworks which help us make sense of reality. And it's a code. It's a very, very deep code that's not in our conscious mind. It's deep, deep down. And, you can't give someone 20 reasons not to be authoritarian and have them say, yeah, okay, yeah, I see. Yeah, sure, I'll change. Because it's coded in much, much deeper than that. It's just not in the rational mind. So the best thing we can do is to understand where other people are at and appreciate that, and use work like Graves's model to help us understand, what is motivating them, what they need, where they're at in the change process. And pretty much all the conflicts that the world has ever seen has come from people wanting to change other people to be like them, like, look at these people, they've got the wrong God, they're not living the right way, they're breaking all the moral rules, they need to be like us,
Mm-hmm.
We
Yeah.
can fix them. Yeah. And that never works. If we look back at history, we can see it never works. The only time when it kind of appears to work is when there's so much power applied that people have no choice but to bow down in the face of that power. But as soon as the power is removed, they go back to the way they used to be, so it doesn't actually change people. And that's something that humanity's still got to learn. We're still yelling at each other, trying to change each other's opinions, and hoping that'll work, when if we actually took notice of history, we'd see it done work.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I see it in the US here more than ever with the political climate, with the election. It's sort of like these two sides that both sort of expand on the same message, like you're saying, which is basically like there's something wrong about what you think and how you feel, and you need to feel and think how I feel. And it seems like really ultimately it feels like it's a sort of an obstacle that's an opportunity to expand our perspective to include both things. And is that sort of some of the drivers for the push to an integral layer, to this like integral perspective, is just the intense polarization sort of requires the need for this expansion to include both, all perspectives somehow?
Yeah, I mean, layer 6, one of the key characteristics of it is that it's very capable of taking different perspectives. It's kind of like has what they call the wisdom of the moccasins. It can put itself in someone else's shoes and really start to appreciate what it must be like to be that person.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I said, it still has that inbuilt rejection factor of other people's values, though. So it can't fully appreciate what it's like to be in another value system, although it might be able to appreciate what it's like to be in a person in a particular scenario in life,
Mm-hmm.
and have compassion for that. But what happens with this transition into second tier is that we reach the end of the dominance of the rational mind. So you can break down those layers into zones. The first one being the pre-rational zone, which is layers 1, 2, and 3. So basic hunter-gatherer type stuff, traditional tribal and martial or warlike behavior, is generally dominated by deep urges and instincts and strong emotions. Okay. And so when you're dealing with people who are operating through those layers, rational arguments generally don't work very well because that's not what's driving them. They'll listen and they'll understand, but at the end of the day, their deep code is saying, follow this urge, follow that instinct, follow that emotion. And that's what they're doing. And then layers 4, 5, and 6, which is your agricultural era, authoritarian, scientific, industrial, highly rational, materialistic, and then this emerging layer 6, humanistic, network-centric. They're all still dominated by the rational mind. So they're looking, to use that rationality to change other people, as you've been saying. Layer 6 also is in a very tricky place because it's just about to reach the end of the usefulness of the rational mind. And in order to prepare the being to make that transition, what it needs to do is it needs to go back and revisit all the pre-rational stuff as well. Just make sure everything's in order, that everything's been finalized as much as possible. Everything's been healed, all the trauma's been dealt with, so that we've got a solid platform to make this huge leap from into second tier. And so poor old layer 6 is kind of like still dominated by the rational mind. It's trying to quieten that mind down. And, there's plenty, there's a million spiritual courses and meditation classes trying to teach you how to quieten the mind. So it's trying to cope with that. It's also trying to cope with all these emotions coming up, and it tends to get somewhat easily overloaded by all of this data coming in from all of these both pre-rational and rational senses in the body. And sometimes it can get quite lost, with that overload of inputs and just not know what to do. And so that's where it just goes back to the I need to be around people that I'm bonded with and who make me feel safe and that understand me, and hence that key driver. But what happens as we get closer to the second tier transition is that the usefulness of the rational mind for solving our problems starts to break down, and does break down entirely. And so we go through that change process, which sometimes, is called the dark night of the soul, where everything falls apart. Everything that we've ever used to solve our problems doesn't seem to work anymore. We have to completely give up, fall apart, crash, burn, and then somehow climb out of the wreckage. And in that wreckage, in the heat of all that change is when our neural networks get rewired, our body chemistry balance changes, new hormones come into play, those sorts of things. And what's on the other side of that is this direct knowing. It's this, what you might call a kind of deep intuition sense, where stuff just comes to us and we can't really explain rationally where it comes from, but we just know what's right. And that's the kind of prize on the other side of that hill that we're all heading towards at the moment. And it's useless to try and solve the world's problems with the rational mind at right now. I mean, I guess useless is probably a bit of a harsh word. It's not useless. It's helpful with problems that are of a certain level of complexity that allows them to be solved with rationality.
Yep.
But as we've been talking about, there are a whole bunch of problems, including, getting on with other people where that rationality just doesn't cut it, So we need to understand our limitations. Those of us who have got the sort of the broader outlook at the moment and the understanding of what's going on in the terrain that we're traversing need to understand that, okay, some of these things aren't going to get solved right now. And it's actually useless putting our rational minded effort into trying to solve that because, that's good. Some people need to be doing that right now, but for those of us who can see further into the future, there are more important things that we need to focus on. And one of those, of course, is helping to support the shift of consciousness. I mean, ultimately, that's the biggest thing that we can do, is to support people who are ready to make the shift to be moving from first tier into second tier, because that's where all the solutions of our most serious issues, serious problems are going to come from.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I've found for myself over the past, however long it's been, especially the past year or so, that I resonate with some of the layer 7 things you're talking about, but I feel like I'm still pretty dominated by my rational mind. But I recognize that in certain areas, it just is obvious that it requires something more, a move beyond that, because a perfect example is the realm of, and I think we find this in a lot of different areas, but the realm of diet, for example, when I was real strong into a layer 5, I was trying to find the perfect diet and all the evidence and the science behind it and all of these things. And the further I've gone on the track of trying to find a diet that is really right for me, the more you find evidence, opposing evidence for any single type of food or diet. Eggs are great for you. Oh no, eggs are terrible for you. This is great for you. This is terrible for you. And there just starts to push you to find some other source of, wisdom within you to guide you as to what you should eat, because these sort of empirically derived forms of information just seem to be more and more complex and sort of more and more, harder to really pin down as to what's true.
Yeah, that's a great example, and if you look at that example through the different layers, I mean, layer 4, the authoritarian, always looks to a higher authority for a list of rules on how to live life. Okay, so from layer 4, it would be, okay, the authority that I respect, and it could be a God that I worship, says in the scriptures, here are the things that I should eat. So there's no choice. There's only one right way to do it in layer 4. And then layer 5, of course, looks for the best. It discards that higher authority and says, no, actually, I can figure it out for myself and I can make it better. I can make it the absolute best and be most successful. And so that's where you get all these, absolute best diet that you really need to be on kind of lists coming from. And then in layer 6, because the focus, it shifts away from my personal success, how can I be the best, to that need for deep human bonding. It's like, okay, here's my network of people that I really trust, who I'm bonded with. What do they all say about what they're eating at the moment? And they'll sit in a circle and say, what are you eating? What are you eating? And everybody reports what they're eating. And then the solution comes from that networked process, right? Mm. But then when we go into second tier, part of what we're doing in layer 6 as preparation for second tier is connecting with our body, which we've pushed to all sorts of limits in layer 5, but not really understood damage that we're doing in the process, like with the planet. And so in layer 6, we're reconnecting with nature. We're also reconnecting with our body, and we're starting to listen to our body, and we're working with that process of, like, casting out through our network, what do we need to be doing right now and how are you doing it? And learning from that. But then eventually, as we start to transition towards second tier, we're connecting with our body to the point where our body's actually speaking to us and we're getting direct knowing coming from our body, and we know that, okay, I can't eat that because when I eat that, I can feel my liver complaining, or something like that. So that's the kind of space that you sound like you're pushing into at the moment, is getting those direct messages and feeling that, why don't I feel so good this morning kind of feeling. And then you think about, okay, maybe it's because I ate or drank that last night. Oh yeah. And you start to put all those bits of information together, and you'll eventually in second tier get to the point where you've got immediate communication from your body that something's right or it's not right. Mm-hmm. Which is then guiding your diet and behavior. Yeah.
Sounds like something to look forward to, because, it just, I think, it just feels like I can sense that I can feel bits of what I feel like you describe in the integral sort of the layer 7, sort of perception and worldview and coping capacity. But I still feel very much like there's a lot of processing of different things going on and things yet to be healed. And so it's like almost you can see a certain light at the end of a tunnel, but that there's just certain territory that you have to traverse no matter what. You can't just skip to this certain spot.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a process, and it's also, one that requires patience. It's just a matter of understanding it. And when you've got a kind of a structure like Graves's model to inform you, then you can start to make deductions like you just have, that, okay, I can see that I'm going through this process. I haven't got all the answers yet, but I kind of understand, where I'm headed, and I kind of understand what might be next for me.
Mhm.
And that's probably about as good as it gets right at the moment. The other interesting thing about second tier is that it's not locked into operating from just one value system, but it's kind of like a shapeshifter. And if there's a problem that can be solved by layer 6 processes, then you'll use that, or if there's a
Mm.
problem that can be solved by layer 1 or layer 2, you'll use that. So it's you're matching the complexity of the issue with the complexity of the solution, and just dynamically moving through the layers as you need to.
So I'm curious to get into something that I've been thinking about for a while, and I really wanted to bring this up to you to kind of see what you think of it. And I don't know how much of this stuff you'll be aware of, or how well I'll be able to articulate this kind of question, but I have been pretty aware and exploring a lot of different information surrounding some of the inconsistencies and manipulative aspects of this whole COVID-19 scenario. And I know you've spoke a little bit about, it seems that there's like an economic reset kind of happening. And I've been diving into a lot of information about the Great Reset, these ideas about, people putting out these books and documents about these plans that are certain, technological things and changes that people want to make to the the way we live in various different ways, to the economy, to the energy systems, to the food system, to biometric IDs and all of these things. And there's certainly, I think, for a lot of people, a certain paranoia about global, like a deep state and a global domination and a new world order and all these things. And understandably so, it can be a scary thing. And but I also recognize, like for me personally, I feel like when I get a bird's eye view on these sort of things, I feel like ultimately it's all sort of a part of the tension that pushes us to evolve, to these next layers of sort of coping capacity. But what I'm thinking about is, um, for one, how much of this stuff you kind of entertain or get into or research just to kind of be informed as to what's going on. I know like Victoria in Australia has had some pretty intense lockdown measures and different things that seem to be way out of proportion for what's going on as far as the death tolls or anything from COVID-19. Um, and I've been sort of racking my brain as far as, some of these plans and things that seem to be laid out as far as certain groups that want to sort of take control of certain things and have plans. I guess what I'm kind of struggling with is, where do you see some of these, uh, a thing like the Great Reset, or the Build Back Better, or the Agenda 2030,
Yeah.
the UN stuff. What layer of consciousness are these things coming from?
They're a combination of layers. And the reason I don't talk about this stuff much is because many, many years ago, when I was consulting as a change management consultant in the corporate sector, I had a big sort of flash of light happen. And I got this message saying, stop trying to fix the old things. They're broke and they're going to,
Mhm.
or actually shift your attention to supporting what's new, and what's growing and what's coming next. And so that's why I don't spend a lot of time talking about these structures that are desperately trying to hang on to power and doing the most outrageous things to try and make that happen, but inevitably destined to fail in the process.
Mhm.
And when it comes to organizations and groups, it's true that you'll always find a mixture of value systems in these groups because people join them for different reasons, and people perceive and are attracted to them for reasons associated with their own value system. So a good example is the United Nations just put out a video recently, I think it was in September, which is their their latest agenda video, and it's a real mixed bag in terms of values. I mean, it's full of a lot of very appropriate and important information about the damage that we're doing to the earth and how we need to change our behavior. But that's interspersed with absolutely authoritarian statements like, this must change, you must support us, and all this kind of stuff, you know.
Yeah.
So it's a real mixed bag in terms of value systems, and there's clearly a lot of layer 4 authoritarian stuff coming through there, which is obviously reflecting people who are inside the organization, you know, and shaping it from that particular value system. There's a lot of really good stuff that's coming from more complex value systems as well. That's very appropriate. And you've got to appreciate that when you look at all of these different pushes, particularly the globalist stuff, is understand that, okay, these organizations are going to have a mixture of people in them. Those people are going to come from a mixture of different value systems, and they're going to be shaping, you know, the overall organization in terms of their ability to influence it from those different value systems. What's true is that as a species, we're moving from an era of individuality to an era of community, and that means that it's very likely that we're going to want to try and have cohesion and collaboration at a global level. Okay, so that's a fundamental driver of humanity right now, is to want that. And depending on which value system that you are dominated by, you're going to try and achieve that in different ways. You know, if you were coming from layer 3, then you might take to the streets with a machete and, you know, change it by violence. If you're coming from layer 4, then you'd be looking for an authoritarian solution where you or the organization you belong to can have absolute, strict, rigid control over what everybody on the planet does. If you're coming from layer 5, then you'd probably be looking to do it in a way that's going to make you a lot of money and make you very successful. And, you know, maybe, like, for example, coming out with a vaccine that's going to make you billions and billions of dollars, and not actually appreciating the human impact in the process. And layer 6, you know, would be looking to do it by making friends with everybody and talking a lot about peace and a lot about what needs to be rebalanced on the planet. And you can see all of that when you look around at the moment. What is going to be most effective in solving the problems that we face as a species on this planet right now is for that globalist push to be shaped by the most complex layer of consciousness that we're capable of rolling out. And right now, when you look around the world, you can see evidence of, you know, the most complex value system that we're capable of rolling out right now, which can dominate the world in some way, has been layer 5. And layer 5's done that through the threat of nuclear war and by, you know, selectively invading countries for strategic advantage and killing a bunch of people. Layer 6 is, of course, pushing all that away and saying, you know, we don't want these wars anymore. We really have to collaborate. And what we're seeing come through at the moment is a lot of regressive messages through as people slip from, like, you know, entering layer 6, they're slipping backwards to layer 4, and the authoritarian kind of stuff comes out, and you'll get statements like, you know, we really need to stop cutting down the trees, and we really need to stop polluting the atmosphere. And if you don't do it right now, you know, it's going to be big trouble. So do what you're told.
Yeah.
So you get a real mixed message like that. And then you've got, you know, from the what's left over from the scientific industrial era, you've got a whole lot of people with a whole lot of money who have become very influential because of that, who come from a mixture of different value systems again, although, you know, predominantly layer 5, because often that's what's allowed them to be successful. And they're looking to profit from what's going on at the moment. You know, they're looking to profit from the problems that the world has, and they're also playing out their own fears. I mean, you've got to remember too that in all of the first tier layers, so 1 through 6, fear is a big driver as well. And it's only when we go into second tier that fear drops away. So, you know, you've got very rich people who are very afraid of overpopulation, you know, because it's going to get in the way of their life and what they want to do to be successful. And, you know, fear of different political systems like communism or socialism and those sorts of things. So it's, I guess what I'm trying to say is it's very complex. You've got to appreciate there are multiple value systems involved here, not just one value system. You've got to appreciate that one of the fundamental drivers for our whole species is to get together at a global level and kind of try and make things work. And everybody's going to be coming at that from the angle of their dominant value system, which means that you're going to get, pure power plays. You're going to get authoritarian attempts to do it. You're going to get profit-making attempts to do it. And we're seeing all that being rolled out at the moment. One of my old spiral dynamics teachers, Don Beck, who was one of the authors of the book, he used to say that during this time towards the end of the first tier, we're going to see every character from history come back and walk the streets, and that was his way of saying that all these value systems are going to flare up at the last minute because they're all trying to kind of save their egos and existence, I guess. Yeah. So it's a very interesting time. One thing's for sure, though, is that if you spend too much time focusing on these issues, you're kind of missing the point. The point is to actually look ahead, to look at what's emerging as new evidence of more complex and more peaceful and more capable ways of living as human beings on this planet. They're the things to focus on right now. And if you go down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories, you're going to waste a whole lot of your time and probably miss the boat, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like, I've definitely found certain value in informing myself about some of the behind the scenes things of what's going on and various, the way sort of the world works or has worked up until this point in certain ways. But for me, it is a little bit like I recognize that it's almost like a junk food habit or something. Like there are plenty of times where I am focused on things that are exciting to me and seem like the future, like regenerative agriculture or various different things. But then there's this sneaking kind of craving for this junk food of like, oh, what's going on with this drama? And I felt like it probably has something to do with, my own part of my own healing. I definitely feel like that's part of the reason why I can still be attracted to to sort of trying to look into the darkness is just probably some of my own shadow work that needs to be done.
I think you're absolutely right there. And you can use those things as tools for your own developmental process, by noticing, okay, what is it that I'm actually getting drawn to at the moment? And what is it about me that's resonating with that, and then go inside and say, okay, there's actually part of me that's a little authoritarian, or there's part of me that's a bit power hungry, that I need to give some attention and do some healing around. Yeah. So everything can be useful in its own way. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting how you described, how you see all that stuff, because that's part of the thing that I think I brought me to that question is, when I would take in some of this information about, let's say, like a globalist agenda type thing, I would see language in it that did seem like, okay, yeah, I see there is something here that does seem like it could potentially be a good intention or something. But then mixed into it, there's some weird forms of like complete control and surveillance and domination. And it's sort of like I've recognized in myself, like during my time of transition from one layer to another, that my mind wants to have complete control and domination through that process because it feels so disconnected from any sort of structure or path that it wants to just somehow lock down and have a complete control. But ultimately it can't, because it's an uncontrollable territory. It's this territory of transition where there is no structure. And so that, I guess, is one way I sort of related it on like a microcosm, macrocosm sort of level.
Yeah, that's good. And I think one of the things that is most difficult for many people at the moment is the attempts by organizations and people who are dominated by layer 5, scientific, industrial, kind of personal success thinking and behavior, because it can be so exploitative, every value system is amazing and useful in the right context. So I don't mean this as a criticism of layer 5, but I just want to point out that layer 5 will do whatever it takes in order to reach its goals. And it's generally the communal value systems that create the moral structures that we live by. So the stability of the communal value systems brings us these, moral guidelines. And then when we bust out into the individual, value systems, usually we're escaping the limitations of those structures, and we want to escape them. We want to do our own thing. So with the individual oriented value systems, they're usually wanting to break the rules, break the moral codes and see what they can do on their own. What if I do it my way? What if I find my own truths? That's just a fundamental aspect of the individual oriented value systems. And so layer 5 has been very much like that. And right to its death, layer 5 will be trying to profit from whatever's going on around it, So even when it sees all of the structures that it's sort of built its life around falling apart, it'll still be going, okay, the world's falling apart because of this pandemic, and the economy is going to hell, but maybe if I come up with a vaccine that can make me a lot of money, I can get really rich and powerful in the process. And so it's exactly what we're seeing, and most people probably will be familiar with the concept of whitewashing or greenwashing, as it's often called these days, is dressing something up to look like something else in order to benefit from it. And so we know that layer 5 is very, very good at that. It's very, very good at making something look like one thing, but then on the inside it's different, and this is where the whole idea of the corporate image came from. It's to look good on the outside, and then doesn't so much matter what's going on the inside of the corporation. And so we should expect anyone who's being driven by layer 5 at the moment to be trying to dress up what they're doing in such a way that it will appeal to most people. And if most people are all of a sudden starting to think differently about the planet and about nature and about themselves, then maybe we should make it look like that, because then we'll get their money as well. And this is why you're seeing things with these strange mixed messages, and maybe the message actually sounds really good, but you just get this feeling that something's not right about what the organization's doing. And that's quite possibly what's going on.
So another area that's intriguing to me that I think you have done a fair bit of research into is the climate change area. And it seems like, is there something similar going on there where there's the climate change, like the strong desire to, fix the climate change thing seems to be a very strong layer 6 motivation. Am I right? But is there a sort of a shadow aspect of 4 that comes into it, where it's like, we need to get off fossil fuels right now, and we need to do the green energy, and we need to do it our way, and it doesn't care I don't care what you think about it. And also even the sort of almost religious aspect of not being able to question the mainstream narrative around it and really have a complete discussion about the cycles of the solar minimum and maximums and all of these other aspects that play into it.
Yeah, it's a big story, and one that I've been thinking about doing another episode or 2 on in the near future. It's funny you should talk about strong desires, because the guy who actually was the first head of the United Nations Environment Program, his name was Strong, Maurice Strong. And when you start to look at the history of how all that unfolded and the whole global warming movement and the people behind it, it starts to show up these differences in value systems and the mixed bag of value systems, with one message being put out, but then you look at the behavior of the people behind the message and it doesn't fit with what they're saying. And certainly Maurice Strong was an example of that. Just very quickly, so he was the first head of the UNEP, as I said, and led the first big conference that they had, I think, in South America around the global warming issue and pollution and stuff. And he'd made his money out of cattle farming and fossil fuel-based activities, and was still doing that at the time. Okay, so straight away, from a values perspective, you've got to say, okay, that doesn't seem right. This guy's leading this organization that's supposedly pushing for a different world, but he's made his money and continues to make his money through all the things that he's saying have to change, right? And he was saying that the industrialized countries have to be disempowered. And he's even on record in a video, which is still on YouTube, saying that people should have licenses before they're allowed to breed. So that they give you insights into who he was as a person. He got caught out taking $1 million bribe in the Middle East during the food for oil deals that were going on with Iraq years back. And as a result of being caught out taking that check, he fled. he left his job at the UN and he fled to China and lived out the rest of his life in China. He's passed away now, but he had very strong connections, I understand, to the Chinese Communist Party. And clearly he had some pretty serious personal moral issues, which led him to leave the job and flee so that he didn't get prosecuted for taking bribes when he was working for the United Nations. So, that's just one very, very small example, which tells me that, okay, this is probably not exactly as it looks when, this whole process. And then as I've researched the climate issue more and more, and with my understanding of how disciplines change as we move through these ages dominated by different value systems, I can see that throughout the scientific industrial era, all of our scientific disciplines went very, very deep in very, very narrow areas of knowledge. And of course, that deepened our knowledge in a whole bunch of different areas. But what was lost in the process was an understanding of how these areas of knowledge are connected with each other. And so we've ended up with a climate science which is rigidly linked to what goes on planet Earth and knows absolutely nothing about any climate influences, which seem to be coming from off the planet, except for the radiation of the sun. And so our sort of mainstream climate science has completely missed the key drivers of our climate on the planet, which are interstellar radiation and the behavior of our local sun. And that has put us into a very tricky situation, because sometime within the next 10 years, this is going to come out and people are going to realize that they've been sold an incorrect story, and whether that was an intentional thing, and quite possibly it was by some people, or whether it was just a factor of, the evolution of value systems and our understanding changing in a natural way. And I'd suggest it's a combination of both of those things. Mm-hmm. What it's going to do in, probably I'd say with some time between now and 2032, in fact, probably before then, probably between now and about 2028, there's going to be a sudden mass realization that the science was wrong. And this story that we've been sold about, the global warming trend and all the science which is in, and the science that complete, so you don't need to look at it anymore. And there's no argument, so stop arguing. People are going to realize that, that actually was wrong. And now we're moving into a period of cold, a mini ice age, as part of the grand solar minimum that's going on. And I've spoken about this in detail before on past Future Sense podcasts, and I'll do some more in the future. And that's one example of a whole bunch of things on the planet at the moment which aren't what they seem. And this comes back to, in many respects, the nature of Layer 5 and its capacity to bend the rules, break the moral codes, and do whatever it takes in order to achieve a goal. Okay. And then justify all of those things it's done by saying, well, look at the outcome. The outcome justified the means. And you can apply this to any industry you want to look at, whether it be war fighting or the pharmaceutical industry or whatever. Mm-hmm. We've seen the same behavior over and over again, whereby the original focus of a system, which was, to serve humanity in some way, has been bent around so that it's now built around an intent of success for an individual or a small number of individuals. And so we've been left with a whole bunch of systems, including our climate advisory system, our pharmaceutical system, you name it, our government systems, which no longer actually do what they were originally designed to do. Our pharmaceutical system doesn't do what it was originally designed to do. It just makes people richer, and it actually keeps people sick by not curing them, but just keeping them well enough to keep buying the pills.
Yeah. And that's another.
That's another story. But what I'm trying to say is that underpinning all of those stories is this one theme of exploitation, and it's nothing is good or bad unless you actually filter it through one of the value systems, and what's good or bad looks different to each value system. So for the people that have been doing this, it's been fine. It's been quite acceptable to their coding. and it's been part of the human journey from the first emergence of humanity and life as hunter-gatherers to where we are today and on into the future. We've had to traverse that terrain, and with any aspect of the situation you want to look at, you'll find that there are good points as well as what seem to be bad points, around them also. So it just comes back to human nature. So there's good reasons why you and many other people aren't feeling quite right about the COVID situation. They're not feeling quite right about climate change. They're not feeling quite right about government systems and elections for good reasons. And this is why our values are changing right now, because these things were useful for a time. They reach their peak, and then once they roll off the peak, they start to actually do more damage than good. And we're right at the end of that cycle for the scientific industrial era, where it's doing so much damage now that people are saying this has got to change. And that's what's driving the evolution of our values.
Are you familiar with Dr. Zach Bush?
I am actually. I hadn't taken a lot of notice of him until just within the last week, actually. And a friend of mine, one of my spirodynamics teachers, Christopher Cook from the UK, turned me on to him and said, just take a look at this video. So I went and watched this video, and there's some evidence of second-tier intelligence there. So yeah, I'm very excited about Zach Bush right now.
Yeah, me too. I've been sort of obsessed with him since the summer here. I stumbled upon one of his interviews, I think in June, and ever since I've just been listening to every interview with him I can find. And it really seems like there is this paradigm shift coming in how we even understand viruses as a form of and germ theory versus terrain theory, and the idea of illnesses and infections and all of these things, and viruses as maybe a form of genetic upgrade.
Yeah,
and an environmental signaling sort of a messaging system versus some sort of straight up pathogenic infectious thing.
Yeah, it's an absolute shift of worldview. He's speaking very, very solidly from layer 6, I can see, and he's very agile, so he'll shift around and talk from a scientific perspective as well. And it looks to me also that he's poking into second tier at times, and talking from layer 7. It's always hard to know these things unless you really sort of meet and get to have a decent conversation with a person, but that's how it looks to me, that he's probably at least in transition from 6 to 7. And I think he's got a massive amount of useful information to pass on, and some really, really useful different perspectives for people to take notice of. And one of them, as you just said, is this idea that the virus is bad, you've got to kill it, that we're being sold at the moment. Well, in fact, it's not even alive, so you can't kill it. But if we look at human history, then some of the most useful things that have ever happened to our species have come through that DNA transfer via a virus. And Zach Bush, as I'm sure you've heard, has been telling the story of things like the evolution of placentas, which allowed mammals to come into being, came from a virus which transferred some genetic material and made that possible. And there are many, many other examples that he gives in his videos. I highly recommend his work at the moment. He's done a great presentation called The Virome, which I've been looking at recently. Really, really useful information. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating stuff, and it's and it's exciting, but as exciting as it is, it's also it's one of those things where you wonder how long is it going to take before this is accepted or common knowledge or integrated into these systems, because it can be so hard to encounter all these situations, whether it's about masks or vaccines or fear around illnesses and death, and have some sort of graceful approach, like having a certain perspective that's so far separated from the mainstream paradigm, and how to sort of like embody that and communicate it while not totally rejecting people for what they still believe. Do you get what I'm trying to say? I know that sounded
I do, absolutely
convoluted.
Yeah, Yeah, it's always a challenge during these times of transition between value systems on the planet, and if we look back to the agricultural transition to the scientific industrial, people were jailed and sort of burnt at the stake for saying certain things that came from the new worldview because they didn't fit the old worldview. And
Yeah.
I guess the modern equivalent of that is things like Julian Assange being imprisoned without any due legal process, people getting chucked off YouTube and banned from various internet sites and those sorts of things. So these are the sort of modern day equivalents of that, and it makes it difficult when you're a pathfinder of change. And it's a real balancing act to be speaking publicly, providing useful information about different perspectives and new ways of doing things, and not actually being branded as a heretic and
Mm.
silenced by the old systems. So I think Zach Bush is doing a really good job at that at the moment. And for everybody who's listening, probably most, if not all, of the listeners to this kind of thing are change makers in the world. It really does pay to think about that balance and getting the balance right. And that is also one reason why I don't go down these conspiracy theory holes too much in my podcast. I mean, apart from the fact that it really just spreads fear anyway, which is not useful.
Yeah.
Also, run the risk of being shut down, and all the good things that you have to say, people miss out on those as well.
Mm-hmm. So, in terms of what you just said, I mean, throughout history, there is evidence that there have been extreme measures taken against sort of these, people that are coming out with information or displaying traits of the next paradigm. And there obviously is various efforts to silence things and surveil people and potentially mandate certain things or whatever. So, and obviously these transitions between value systems are very chaotic and there is a lot of disruption. And so obviously nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. But when you contemplate this transitionary period, I mean, what types of things is it reasonable to prepare for? Where is that line between being fearful and just simply trying to look at things for what they are and consider actual potential outcomes and consequences as far as whether it's authoritarian measures or censorship and surveillance or various different things, or just simply natural disasters or the electric grid going down. Where's the line between like conspiracy theorist and prepper and just sort of common sense? Like, how bad can we imagine that things might get, I guess?
Yeah, really good question. I guess my first response to that would be to find your path. Everybody has a path that is laid down for them to some extent in terms, and you might even say by their own choice before incarnating on this planet. And by tuning in to what's right for us individually, we'll be taken to the places we need to be, and we'll be brought the information we need to have in order to fulfill, the things that we've come here to fulfill. And I think that first and foremost is really the best kind of compass or direction finding advice that I can give. If you start to become fearful and think, do I need to buy a generator or a semi-automatic rifle and this kind of stuff, then you go down that rabbit hole of fear and you completely lose your connection to your true self and your true path. And that's really the worst thing you can do, to end up like living in a bunker somewhere and wasting your life on this beautiful planet. So I think first and foremost, be in the world, be where you feel to be, and do what you feel is right for you, first and foremost. In terms of how bad things can get and how to approach that, I think the way these sorts of major transitions usually pan out is you get small pockets of the future appearing, and that's, one of the things I say about the Future Sense podcast is the future's already here. That famous quote from William Gibson, I think, was the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. So if you look around and you know what to look for, you'll find the future. You'll find future ways of living. You'll find future ways of relating to other human beings, and they're all out there right now. So in the process of finding your own path, seek out the people that you resonate with, and you'll find pockets. I mean, I'm living in Byron Shire in northern New South Wales in Australia, where this whole shire really is a pocket of people who decades ago realized that there were different ways to live, and they came here to try and practice that. And so now we've got a reasonably sustainable pocket of largely layer 6 kind of folks, and a good a sprinkling of second tier who are living very differently than most people live on the planet, and doing it quite successfully. There are local organic food growers, and there are markets where you can go buy that stuff without the sort of huge structures of middlemen in the supply chains and those sorts of things. And when I look at what I know about what's probably coming over the next 2 decades, I think the best thing you can do is to find your people and get as sustainable as you can be. Sometime, if I had to put a time frame on it, I'd say that probably, what is it now, 2020? I think within the next 6 to 8 years, you ought to look at finding where you need to be, finding folks that you resonate with, and diving into your own personal path and doing whatever it is that you feel you're here to do, whether you're a healer or a dentist or whatever. Do your thing and do it well, and do it surrounded by people that you resonate with in a place that you feel like you belong. I have seen predictions from sources I regard as reliable of the implications of the coming climate change, which at this stage is still giving us spikes between hot and cold conditions, but eventually will settle down. And certainly some astrophysicists that I trust are saying by 2028 it's going to be really, really clear that, okay, we're entering into a cooling phase here. If we look back to previous cooling phases like the Maunder minimum and those sorts of things, not the whole planet went freezing cold all at once. There were some places that actually got hot during those periods and stayed warmer. But overall, the Northern Hemisphere in particular was fairly heavily cooled, and at some point the Thames froze over for a while and that kind of thing, and that's going to interrupt food production, because a lot of the places where we're growing our food at the moment are in climates that are working okay, but those climates are changing. So we've already got some food shortages on the planet. That's going to get worse, and the best thing we can do is to find a community where we can become locally sustainable as much as possible, and that means food growing and energy production in particular, I think. And communities will grow naturally, and you'll get a mix of people attracted to a community who bring all the different skills, like health and well-being, medical, and those sorts of things that a community needs. So a lot of that stuff just happens naturally. But I think the big things that we should be looking at are localized energy production, and also food supplies that have fairly short supply chains, where that ideally is grown locally, organically, or it doesn't have to travel too far. Because once the climate change does start getting more severe, then it's going to be more difficult to grow food. At times it will be more difficult to travel. And the disruption to large concentrations of people who are still living very much according to the old value systems, I think they're going to be significant. So you don't want to be in a place where people haven't been preparing, they haven't been understanding what's going on, and they're getting caught out.
Right, and you're dependent on them for certain food items or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. I think COVID's been a wonderful little introduction to that. All of a sudden you go to the supermarket and what you want isn't there. We're not used to that. How did that happen? And it's all the early signs have come with the COVID disruption. If you look at what's happened and you start to think about, okay, what if that happened, but it was 10 times as bad? How would we be? What would we need to do? And in the process of all of that, I don't want to kind of encourage a prepper mentality in the classic sense of that word. what I want to encourage is how do we make ourselves more reliable and sustainable at a personal level, so that we can then help others.
Yeah.
And of course, even through simple things like broadcasting information on podcasts, you're helping people all around the world. And because of the spread of people who like that conga line I often talk about, like the conga where people dance in a line. You've got people who are up the front of the line and people down the back of the line, a whole bunch of people in the middle. So it's up to the folks who are up the front of the line in terms of this change process to realize, okay, here's what we need, and then do what we can to support those people who are further back down the line from us and maybe don't have the insights, don't have the early opportunities to change and those sorts of things. How can we create systems to help them along through this same process as well?
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate the insight about following the path. That's a good reminder that, we don't need to try to control and think about exactly what we need to do to react to all this. It's like if you're staying in alignment with your path, that stuff sort of takes care of itself.
Exactly.
But also, I mean, for me personally, as far as the kind of prepper thing, I don't resonate with the prepper in the traditional sense of the term like you're talking about, but I find myself as on my sort of journey of transition into a layer 6 sort of deal, have just found myself naturally attracted to things that you're talking about, as far as just sort of a realization of, shit, I don't know much about the land around me. Like, what species of plants can I eat? What are the mushrooms I can eat? How do I hunt these animals around here? How would I set up a permaculture garden? Or, I just find myself naturally attracted to foraging and hunting and learning about the land and feeling more connected to some feeling of security within the environment and the community. Not like I'm dependent upon a pineapple coming from halfway around the world, for my lunch. Not that I don't love a pineapple, but you know what I mean? It's just sort of the realization of how fragile and disconnected everything is, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. We also need to look to new technologies as well. I mean, there's some great stuff coming through at the moment, like automated farming setups, and indoor farming, vertical farming, those sorts of things, which can allow us to grow things that might not normally grow in a particular environment. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is it's not about getting back to basics and making sort of furniture out of sticks. It's also about using our technology to the best ability that we can, and building things which are going to help us along the way. I think another risk that we need to be aware of is the risk of increasing cosmic radiation and how that can impact both our well-being and also the technologies that we're using. There's a big sunspot facing Earth right at the moment, which if it had a big cough, it could wipe out our electrical systems for a while. So we need to take those things into account. And I believe that all the technologies we need to survive and thrive during the times ahead are probably already here right now. Some of them are probably being suppressed, but in good time, they'll become available as well.
Yeah. Interesting stuff. Yeah, it's interesting what you say about farming, because it does, I mean, do you see there's a lot of ideas technology wise that seem to be so, like carbon sucking machines, for example. There are people who are talking about using carbon sucking machines to pull carbon out of the atmosphere to help climate change. But then you find certain things like regenerative agriculture, where these cover crops and these different principles can actually sequester carbon from the atmosphere into the soil. So it's almost like you're trying to create something that can already be done naturally.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I don't question the fact that we've damaged our atmosphere with pollution. There's no doubt that we've done that. But I don't think carbon is the issue that a lot of people are saying it is, to be honest. If as the grand solar minimum progresses, we're going to get an increase of low-level cloud cover on the planet, which is going to be one of the key cooling mechanisms. And we may well, if there was any sudden extremely effective activity to reduce global warming on the planet, it may actually work counter to our needs in the future. I guess that's what I'm trying to say as we go through this cool period that seems to be approaching.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time here, but it's great talking to you. I mean, I'm sure there's plenty more stuff that I would love to talk to you about, but yeah, so can people expect a new episode of Future Sense coming out anytime in the near future?
I've actually been thinking about maybe doing one on the globalists, which we sort of covered pretty well in this. So I might have a listen to this and see if whether I need to add anything to what I've said, but I'll certainly put this episode out through the Future Sense channel, probably in 2 parts, given the length of it. As I've done before when you and I have spoken. And I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to you. I'm going to be traveling over the next few weeks, as I mentioned, up to central Queensland to visit my Aboriginal relatives up there and do some plant medicine exploration. So it may well be that this is the only episode that comes out within the next 2 to 3 weeks, and I'll get something out after that, I expect, yeah.
Very cool.
Just before I close, can I just give my cousin Rob McDonald a plug for this artwork in the background here?
Yes.
Rob lives up on the Sunshine Coast here in Australia. He's an amazing artist. You can find him, Robert McDonald, artist. I'm sure if you just Google that on the web, you'll find his stuff. It all kind of looks very swirly and interdimensional and psychedelic like that. Thanks.
Yeah, definitely. It's awesome stuff. If you do the globalist episode, I realized one sort of aspect of it that I am curious about that you don't need to answer right now, but just to put it into your mind, is this sort of like how does the Graves model give us confidence that we're not going to descend into some Hunger Games reality of global control and domination and sort of that sort of dystopian future? That's something that's interesting to me. So just a little note there. And I think I know that I have peers that are wondering the same thing, that we talk about, like, yeah, we kind of feel like there's this positive sense that things are going to evolve to these higher layers and that there won't be this sort of dystopian reality, but there's this still some sort of background question of like, is that really what's going to happen, or are we just screwed,
Just very quickly, there are dystopian realities happening on this planet every day. Most of us don't get to see them because we live in comfortable places, but they're out there. So it's not like it's some weird thing that's going to pop up that we haven't experienced before. It's out there. And it's true that we need a certain amount of tension in order to drive the change. It's just a matter of how much tension we need and whether we can consciously, choose the change. Yeah.
Yeah, where what you said is a perfect example of there could be small, sustainable layer 6 and 7 communities, while simultaneously there is a dystopian reality existing in parallel with that.
Absolutely. It's a matter of, getting to the point where you have the capacity to choose which one you want to create.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you again, Steve.
Thanks, Jacob. Great to talk to you, mate. Always.